Something quiet has been happening to you lately. You can't quite name it. But things that used to matter, things you used to chase, argue about, cling to, they've started to lose their grip. Not because anything went wrong, but because something inside you shifted. You haven't become lazy. You haven't given up on life. But if you're being honest with yourself, you started pulling away from things that once felt normal. The constant need to prove yourself, the obsession with being liked, the rush to fill every silence with noise. And the strangest part, you don't miss any of it. If that sounds like you, then stay right here, because what we're about to explore might finally explain what's been quietly unfolding inside you. According to Carl Jung, one of the most profound psychologists who ever lived, this isn't loss, it isn't depression, it is the beginning of something sacred. Today we'll walk through the things that spiritually awake people slowly, sometimes without even realizing it, stop doing. And more importantly, we'll uncover why, through Jung's lens, each of these shifts is not a sign that something is wrong with you, but powerful evidence that your soul is finally waking up. So, stay with us until the very end, because if you've been feeling like you no longer fit into the world the way you used to, you may discover today that you were never meant to. You were meant to outgrow it. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Have you noticed yourself quietly letting go of things that once consumed you? I'd love to hear what shifted for you first. Have you ever looked around at the people in your life, at the noise, the drama, the endless striving, and felt a strange distance? Not anger, not judgment, just a quiet knowing that you're no longer part of it the way you once were. Maybe you used to fight for attention. Maybe you used to say yes to everything, fill your calendar, chase approval, measure your worth by how busy or needed you felt. But now, something has changed. The hunger is gone, and in its place, there's a stillness that others don't quite understand. They might call it withdrawal. They might worry about you. But deep down, you know the truth. You're not falling apart. You're falling inward. Carl Jung spent his life studying this exact transformation. He called it individuation, the process by which a person stops living according to the expectations of the outer world and begins the slow, often painful, deeply beautiful work of becoming who they actually are. And here's what Jung understood that most people still don't. This process doesn't begin with a dramatic revelation. It begins with subtraction. You don't suddenly become enlightened. You slowly stop doing the things that kept you asleep. One habit falls away, then another. Then a belief you held your entire life quietly dissolves, and you realize you feel lighter without it. That is not a breakdown. That is your psyche reorganizing itself around a deeper center of gravity, what Jung called the self. So let's talk about what these things are, the behaviors, the patterns, the invisible chains that spiritually awakening people slowly release. And as we go through each one, pay attention. Because if you recognize yourself in even one of these, it may be the clearest sign yet that something profound is already underway inside you. The first thing spiritually awake people stop doing is seeking approval from others. There was a time when you needed it, the nod, the praise, the reassurance that you were doing things right, that people liked you, that you belonged. Maybe you shaped your opinions around what others thought. Maybe you dressed a certain way, spoke a certain way, laughed at things that weren't funny, agreed with things you didn't believe, all because somewhere deep inside you were terrified that the real you wouldn't be enough. And it worked for a while. The approval came. People accepted you. But there was always this hollow feeling underneath it. Because the version of you they were accepting wasn't really you. It was a performance, a carefully constructed image designed to avoid rejection. Jung called this the persona. the mask we wear to navigate the social world. And the persona isn't evil, it's necessary. We all need one. But Jung warned that when we mistake the mask for the face, when we forget that the persona is a tool and start believing it's who we actually are, the soul begins to suffocate. And that's exactly what happens when your life revolves around approval. Every compliment feeds the mask. Every like, every validation, every "you're doing so well" lands on the surface and never reaches the real person underneath. You become addicted to a version of love that doesn't actually touch you. And the tragedy is, the more approval you receive for the persona, the more invisible the true self becomes. You're applauded, but the part of you that's being applauded doesn't even exist. Meanwhile, the part that does exist, the messy, complicated, imperfect, deeply real you, sits in the dark, unseen, unfed waiting. So what happens when you start to wake up? The hunger for approval begins to fade. Not all at once, it's gradual. You catch yourself about to say something just to impress someone, and you stop. You notice you're about to post something just for the reaction, and you put the phone down. You realize you've been agreeing with someone you actually disagree with, and for the first time, you let the silence sit there instead of filling it with performance. This feels terrifying at first, because without the approval, who are you? Without the audience, what's the point? And this is the moment where most people retreat back into the mask. The discomfort of being unseen feels worse than the emptiness of being falsely seen. But if you stay with it, if you let the discomfort pass, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to hear your own voice again, not the voice that says what others want to hear, the one underneath, the one that has been waiting patiently for you to stop performing long enough to listen. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that process begins the moment you stop outsourcing your sense of self to the opinions of others. It begins the moment you realize that no amount of external validation will ever fill the space that only self-knowledge can fill. When you stop seeking approval, you don't become arrogant. You don't become cold or indifferent. You become free. Free to be honest. Free to be wrong. Free to be genuinely, imperfectly, beautifully human without needing anyone's permission to do so. The second thing spiritually awake people stop doing is trying to control everything. Think about how much of your energy has gone into trying to manage outcomes, planning every detail, anticipating every problem, gripping the steering wheel of your life so tightly your knuckles turn white. You controlled conversations, controlled relationships, controlled how people perceived you. And underneath all that control was one thing: fear. Fear that if you let go, even for a moment, everything would fall apart. Jung understood this impulse deeply. He saw it as the ego's desperate attempt to maintain order in a universe that is, by its very nature, unpredictable. The ego wants certainty. It wants safety. It wants safety. It wants satiety. It wants to know what's coming next so it can prepare. And in small doses, this is healthy. We need the ego to function. But when the ego becomes a tyrant, when it demands absolute control over every aspect of your life, it begins to strangle the very thing that's trying to emerge. Because here's the paradox Jung kept returning to. The things that matter most in life, love, meaning, transformation, creativity, none of them can be controlled. They can only be surrendered to. You cannot control when insight arrives. You cannot force yourself to fall in love. You cannot plan your way into wisdom. These things come from a place deeper than the ego, from what Jung called the unconscious, and they operate on their own timeline according to their own logic in ways the conscious mind will never fully predict. So when you try to control everything, you're essentially building a dam across a river. The water backs up, pressure builds, and eventually something breaks. Jung saw this pattern over and over in his patients. The people who controlled the most were often the ones who suffered the most dramatic breakdowns, not because they were weak, but because they had been fighting against the natural current of their own psyche for so long that the psyche finally erupted. And what does it look like when you stop? It looks like allowing a conversation to go somewhere you didn't plan. It looks like sitting with uncertainty without immediately reaching for a solution. It looks like letting someone be upset with you without rushing to fix it. It looks like trusting that you don't need to have every answer right now. And yes, it looks like fear. Real, honest, trembling fear. Because letting go of control means accepting that you are not the master of everything that happens to you, and that terrifies the ego. But underneath that terror, there is something else, relief. The kind of relief you feel when you've been holding something heavy for so long you forgot you were holding it, and someone finally says, you can put that down now. That is what it feels like to release control, not recklessness, not passivity, but a conscious decision to work with life instead of against it. To stop white-knuckling your way through every day and instead to trust that the psyche has its own wisdom, its own direction, its own timing. Jung believed that the unconscious is not your enemy. It is your deepest ally. But you can only hear its guidance when you loosen the grip of the ego long enough to listen. And the spiritually awake person has begun to understand this. They still plan, they still act, but they hold their plans loosely. They leave room for the unexpected. They understand that sometimes the best thing you can do is step back and let something larger than you take the lead. The third thing spiritually awake people stop doing is running from their own darkness. This is the one that changes everything. Because you can stop seeking approval. You can release control. But until you turn around and face what's been living in your shadow, the transformation stays on the surface. It looks good. It sounds good. But it doesn't reach the bone. Jung's concept of the shadow is perhaps his most important contribution to understanding the human soul. The shadow is everything about yourself that you've pushed away, hidden, denied, or refused to look at. It's the anger you were told was unacceptable, the jealousy you're ashamed of, the grief you never fully processed, the desires you've labeled as wrong, the parts of your personality that didn't fit the image you were trying to project. And here's what most people don't realize. The shadow doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It goes underground. It operates from the dark. It leaks into your life in ways you don't consciously recognize. The person who suppresses their anger doesn't stop being angry. They become passive-aggressive, or they attract angry people into their life, or they develop chronic tension in their body that they can't explain. The person who denies their need for love doesn't stop needing it. They become controlling or emotionally unavailable, or they sabotage relationships right at the moment when real intimacy becomes possible. The shadow always finds a way to express itself. The question is whether you meet it consciously or let it run your life from behind the curtain. Jung said something that still echoes through every conversation about psychological growth. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Read that again, because this is the mechanism that keeps most people stuck for decades. They think life is happening to them. They think they're unlucky or cursed or just wired for suffering, but what's actually happening is that unexamined parts of their own psyche are pulling strings they can't see. The shadow is choosing their partners. The shadow is picking their fights. The shadow is writing the story they think is being written by the world. So what does it look like when a spiritually awake person stops running from this? It doesn't look glamorous. It looks like sitting with the parts of yourself that make you uncomfortable. It looks like admitting, truly admitting, not as a performance of humility, but as a raw act of honesty, that you are capable of pettiness, of cruelty, of selfishness, of cowardice, that these things live in you, not because you're broken, but because you're human. It looks like the moment you stop projecting your shadow onto other people, because that's what we do when we refuse to face our own darkness. We see it in everyone else. The quality you despise most in another person, look closely. Jung would say that's your shadow waving at you. Not always, but often enough that it's worth sitting with the question, what if the thing that infuriates me about this person is the thing I refuse to see in myself? This is shadow work, and it is not comfortable. It is not a weekend workshop or a journaling exercise, although those things can help. It is a lifelong commitment to meeting yourself honestly, to descending into the basement of your own psyche with a lantern and looking at what's there without flinching. And here's what Jung discovered, both in himself and in his patients. The shadow is not only dark, the shadow also contains gold. Talents you were told were impractical. Passions you abandoned because they weren't responsible. Parts of your creative nature that you buried under layers of obligation and conformity. When you descend into the shadow, you don't just confront your demons, you reclaim your buried treasure. The spiritually awake person understands this. They don't try to be all light. They don't perform positivity. They make room for all of it, the beauty and the brutality, the tenderness and the teeth. And in doing so, they become something far more powerful than a good person. They become a whole one. The fourth thing spiritually awake people stop doing is identifying with their thoughts. There's a voice in your head. You've heard it your entire life. It narrates everything. It judges. It worries. It rehearses arguments you'll never have. It replays conversations from 3 years ago. It tells you stories about who you are, what you deserve, what's going to happen next, and most of those stories are not true. For most of your life, you believe that voice was you. When it said, you're not good enough, you felt that as a fact about yourself. When it said, this is going to go wrong, you braced for impact as though the prediction were certain. When it said you should be further along by now, you absorbed that like a judgment from the highest court. The voice spoke, and you obeyed. Not because you're weak, because nobody ever told you that you and your thoughts are not the same thing. Jung made a distinction that cuts through perhaps the deepest confusion of human experience. He distinguished between the ego, which is the center of your conscious awareness, your everyday I, and the self, which is the totality of your being, conscious and unconscious, a center far deeper and far wiser than the chattering mind. The ego thinks in words. It builds narratives. It categorizes and compares and judges. The self communicates differently, through dreams, through intuition, through the body, through those strange moments when you know something without being able to explain how. When you identify completely with the thinking mind, you live in a very small room. Everything is filtered through language, through logic, through the stories the ego constructs, to make sense of a world that is, at its core, far stranger and more mysterious than any story can contain. And the problem is not that thinking is bad. The problem is that most of us are imprisoned by it without even knowing we're in a cell. The shift happens slowly. One day you catch yourself in the middle of a spiral of worry, and instead of being consumed by it, you notice it. You see the thought. You see yourself seeing the thought. And in that tiny gap between the thinker and the observer, something opens, a space, a stillness. A presence that was always there, buried underneath the noise, waiting for you to stop talking long enough to feel it. This is not an intellectual achievement. You cannot think your way to this. It is an experiential shift, and once it begins, it changes everything. You start to realize that the anxious voice is not delivering news about reality. It's running an old program, a pattern formed years ago, maybe decades ago, that no longer applies to your current life. You start to see that the self-critical voice isn't telling you the truth about your worth. It's echoing something someone said to you when you were very young, something that got lodged in your psyche like a splinter and has been generating pain ever since. And gradually, you stop letting these thoughts run the show, not by fighting them, not by replacing negative thoughts with positive ones, which is just the ego playing a different game, but by creating distance, by learning to witness without reacting, by understanding at a level deeper than language that you are the sky, not the weather. The thoughts will come, the thoughts will go, but you, the part of you that watches, that is the part that endures. Jung understood that this disidentification from thought is essential to psychological maturity. The ego must be strong enough to function in the world, but flexible enough to step aside when something deeper needs to speak. The spiritually awake person has not killed their ego. They've simply stopped mistaking it for the whole of who they are, and in doing so, they gain access to a kind of calm that doesn't depend on circumstances, a kind of peace that isn't the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something vast enough to hold difficulty without being destroyed by it. The fifth thing spiritually awake people stop doing is engaging in conflict for the sake of being right. You used to love a good argument, or maybe you didn't love it exactly, but you couldn't resist it. Someone said something wrong. Someone posted something ignorant. Someone at dinner made a claim that was clearly, obviously incorrect, and something in you rose up and said, I have to correct this. And then you did. You argued. You debated. You presented your evidence. Maybe you won. Maybe you didn't. But either way, you walked away feeling drained, and the other person's mind hadn't changed even slightly. Sound familiar? There was a time when you couldn't let a single wrong statement go unchallenged. Every argument felt personal. Every disagreement felt like a referendum on your intelligence, your values, your identity. And the reason it felt that way is because it was. When you're deeply identified with the ego, being right isn't just a preference. It's a survival strategy. The ego maintains itself through positions, through opinions, through the story of, I am the kind of person who thinks this. And when someone challenges that story, the ego experiences it not as a difference of perspective, but as an existential threat. That's why arguments generate so much heat. It's never really about the topic. It's about the ego fighting to preserve itself. And the more fragile the ego, the more ferocious the fight. Think about the people you know who argue the most, the ones who turn every conversation into a competition, the ones who can never let a point go, who have to have the last word, who would rather destroy a relationship than concede an inch. Those are signs of strength. They're signs of a self-concept that's so unstable it requires constant defense. So what happens as you wake up? The need to be right starts to dissolve. Not because you stop having opinions, not because you become a pushover, but because you realize slowly and then all at once that most arguments aren't about truth. They're about ego. And you simply don't have the energy for that anymore. You don't want to win. You want to understand. And those are very different desires. You start to listen differently. Where you once listened for weaknesses in the other person's argument, you now listen for what they're actually trying to say. Where you once waited for your turn to speak, you now allow the silence to sit. And sometimes you realize the other person isn't wrong. They just see something you haven't seen yet. And that realization, which once would have felt like defeat, now feels like growth. Jung spoke about this in terms of holding the tension of opposites. He believed that the mature psyche can hold two contradictory truths at the same time without needing to resolve them immediately. This isn't weakness. This is the highest form of psychological strength. The ability to say, I believe this, and I see why you believe that, and I don't need to destroy your position to maintain my own. This is what it looks like when the ego stops being the entire identity and becomes one voice among many in a much larger conversation. The spiritually awake person still has convictions. They still stand for things, but they've stopped weaponizing their knowledge. They've stopped using intelligence as a club. And they've discovered something surprising. When you stop trying to be right all the time, people actually start listening to you more, because they can feel the difference between someone who wants to win and someone who wants the truth. And truth, real truth, doesn't need to shout. It just needs space. The sixth thing spiritually awake people stop doing is filling silence with noise. Remember when you couldn't be alone with your own mind for more than 5 minutes? The television was always on. The music was always playing. The podcast was always running. Scrolling, texting, refreshing, anything to avoid the one thing that terrified you more than any external threat: silence. And it wasn't just environmental noise, it was internal noise too. The planning, the worrying, the replaying, the fantasizing about conversations that might happen, the constant mental chatter that served one purpose and one purpose only: to keep you from having to be present with yourself. There's a reason silence feels dangerous when you're asleep, because silence is where everything you've been avoiding lives. The grief, the loneliness, the questions you're afraid to answer, the truth about your relationship, your job, your life, that you already know but haven't been brave enough to admit. Noise covers all of that. As long as something is playing, something is buzzing, something is demanding your attention, you don't have to sit with any of it. And for years, maybe decades, that strategy worked perfectly, but it stopped working, didn't it? At some point, the noise started feeling like a prison instead of a protection. The show you used to binge doesn't hold your attention anymore. The social media feed that used to numb you now makes you feel worse. The constant stimulation that once felt normal now feels like an assault on something inside you that's trying to be heard. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates most clearly in moments of stillness. In dreams, yes, but also in the waking silence, in the pauses between activities, in the empty spaces we're so desperate to fill. He believed that the soul speaks in a whisper, and if your life is too loud, you will never hear it. Not because the soul is weak, but because the noise is a wall and the soul will not shout over it. It waits. It has always been waiting. This is why the spiritually awake person begins to crave silence in a way that confuses the people around them. They turn off the car radio and drive in stillness. They sit on the porch without their phone. They wake up early, not to be productive, but to be present. And what they find in that silence is not the emptiness they feared. It is fullness, a presence, a depth of experience that was always there, underneath the noise, like a river running below the street. In that silence, things begin to surface: memories, emotions, fragments of dreams, insights that don't come through logic, but through a kind of knowing that has no words. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the dialogue between the conscious and unconscious mind. It can only happen in stillness, The ego must quiet down for the deeper self to be heard, and when it is heard, what it says is often startling. Not because it's new information, but because it's information you've always had and have been drowning out. Silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of everything. The noise was hiding, and the spiritually awake person has stopped being afraid of what they'll find there. They've learned to sit with it, to let it rise, to let it teach them. And in doing so, they've discovered that the silence is not empty at all. It is the most honest, most alive, most sacred space they've ever entered. The seventh thing spiritually awake people stop doing is chasing happiness as a permanent state. This might be the most counterintuitive one, because isn't happiness the point? Isn't that what we're all supposed to be pursuing? Every self-help book, every motivational speaker, every ad and algorithm tells us the same thing. Be happy, find your bliss, live your best life. And so you tried. You chased it. You rearranged your external world over and over again, convinced that the right job, the right relationship, the right home, the right body would finally deliver the feeling you'd been promised, and sometimes it came, briefly. A flash of joy after the promotion, a surge of excitement at the start of the relationship, a moment of satisfaction when you achieved the goal, but it never lasted. The feeling faded, the newness wore off, and you were left standing in the same place you started, wondering why the thing that was supposed to make you happy only made you hungry for the next thing. Jung would not have been surprised by this, because Jung understood something about the human psyche that the modern happiness industry actively conceals. The soul does not want happiness. The soul wants wholeness, and these are not the same thing. Happiness is a surface emotion. It comes and goes. It depends on circumstances. You're happy when things go well and unhappy when they don't, and this is perfectly natural. There is nothing wrong with happiness. But when you make it the goal of your entire existence, when you organize your life around the avoidance of suffering and the pursuit of pleasure, you cut yourself off from half of what it means to be human. Jung saw that the most meaningful transformations in his patients' lives did not come from happy events. They came from crises, from breakdowns, from periods of intense darkness that forced them to confront parts of themselves they'd been avoiding. He called this the night sea journey, the descent into the depths of the unconscious, where the old self dies and something new is born. And there is nothing pleasant about it. It is disorienting. It is painful. It is the psychological equivalent of being swallowed whole by something enormous and having to find your way out from the inside. But it is also the path to something far more valuable than happiness. It is the path to meaning, to depth, to a life that isn't just comfortable, but real. The spiritually awake person has begun to understand this. They no longer panic when sadness arrives. They don't immediately try to fix grief, numb pain, or escape discomfort. They've learned to ask, what is this trying to show me? Instead of, how do I make this stop? They sit with the difficult feeling. They let it speak, and often what it says is more important than anything the happy feeling ever told them. This doesn't mean they're miserable. It means they've expanded their definition of a good life to include the full range of human experience. Joy and sorrow, connection and solitude, certainty and confusion, light and shadow. They've stopped trying to live in the top half of the emotional spectrum and have discovered that the bottom half, the places where grief and longing and tenderness live, is where the soul does its deepest work. Jung put it simply, even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness. and the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. The awake person hasn't given up on joy. They've just stopped demanding it as a constant state, and in releasing that demand, they've found something more sustaining than happiness could ever be: peace. Not the peace of circumstances going well, but the peace of no longer being at war with the full truth of being alive. The eighth thing spiritually awake people stop doing is holding on to relationships that exist only out of obligation. This one cuts deep, because we've been taught that loyalty means forever, that family means unconditional tolerance, that walking away from a relationship, any relationship, is failure, and so you held on to the friendship that drained you every time you met, to the family dynamic that made you feel small, to the connection that stopped being a connection years ago but continued out of habit, out of guilt, out of the fear that if you let go, you'd be the bad one. And you performed your role beautifully. You showed up, you answered the calls, you swallowed your discomfort and told yourself it was love. But if you looked honestly at how you felt after those interactions, the word that comes up isn't love, it's depletion, resentment, a kind of hollowness that you couldn't name, but that followed you home every time. Jung spoke extensively about the persona and how it shapes our relationships. Many of the connections we maintain are not connections between two real people. They are connections between two masks. You show your persona, they show theirs, and the relationship survives on the surface while both souls starve underneath. This is especially true in family systems where roles are assigned early and enforced for life. You're the responsible one. You're the peacekeeper. You're the one who holds everything together. And these roles become cages that look like love. The awakening begins when you start to feel the weight of those cages, when you realize that the exhaustion you feel after certain interactions isn't just tiredness. It's your soul telling you that this dynamic is costing you something essential. When you begin to notice that you are a different person around certain people, a smaller person, a quieter person, a more apologetic person, and that this version of you isn't an adaptation, it's a regression. Letting go doesn't always mean cutting people off. Sometimes it means changing the terms, drawing a boundary, telling the truth about what you need instead of performing what they expect. But sometimes, yes, it means walking away, and that is where the guilt lives. Because the world will tell you that you're selfish, that you're abandoning people, that real love means enduring anything. But Jung would ask a different question. Is it love if it requires you to abandon yourself? Is it connection if it only works when you suppress who you actually are? The spiritually awake person doesn't leave relationships out of cruelty. They leave relationships that are already empty, but no one was brave enough to name it. They don't burn bridges. They simply stop walking across bridges that lead nowhere. And in the space that opens up, something remarkable happens. The relationships that remain become deeper, truer, more nourishing. Because when you stop spreading yourself thin across obligations, you have real energy to give to the people who actually meet you where you are. Jung believed that authentic relationship, what he called true encounter, can only happen between two people who have done enough inner work to show up without the mask. And that requires both courage and discernment. Courage to be seen, and discernment to know who is safe enough to see you. The awake person cultivates both. They don't love less, they love more honestly, and they've learned that the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for the other person, is to stop pretending. The ninth thing spiritually awake people stop doing is living according to someone else's definition of success. You spent years building something, a career, a lifestyle, a reputation. You did what you were supposed to do. You followed the path that was laid out for you by your parents, your culture, your generation. Go to school, get a good job, make money, buy the house, build the resume, achieve, achieve, achieve. And you did it, or you tried to. And somewhere along the way, you looked up and realized that the life you built doesn't feel like yours. It looks right from the outside. It checks all the boxes. But when you sit with it in the quiet, when no one else is watching, there's a dissonance, a gap between what your life looks like and what it feels like, between the person the world thinks you are and the person you know yourself to be when no one's looking. And that gap, that is the space where the soul has been trying to get your attention. Jung talked about this especially in the context of midlife, though it can happen at any age. He observed that the first half of life is typically spent building the ego's agenda. Education, career, social position, identity, these are necessary tasks. You need to build a self before you can transcend one. But he also observed that many people reach a point where the ego's agenda stops being enough, where the achievements feel hollow, where the status feels meaningless, where the question shifts from how do I succeed to what does success even mean. This is not a crisis. This is an invitation. It's the soul tapping on the shoulder of the ego and saying, thank you for everything you've built, but we're not done. There's more, and the more isn't out there. It's in here. The spiritually awake person starts to detach from external markers of success, not always dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle. They stop comparing their career to other people's careers. They stop measuring their worth by their productivity. They stop feeling guilty on a Saturday afternoon for doing nothing. They begin to ask different questions, not what should I achieve next, but what am I being called to? Not what will impress people, but what feels true. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because when you stop following someone else's script, there's often a period where you don't have a new one yet. The old goals are gone, but the new direction hasn't fully revealed itself. You're in between stories. And that in-between space is one of the most disorienting, most necessary, and most fertile experiences a human being can go through. Jung called it the death of the old attitude. Something in you has to die for something new to be born. The old definition of success, the one given to you by your family, your school, your culture, has to crumble before your own definition can emerge from the ruins. And that crumbling feels like failure to everyone who's still playing by the old rules. But to you, it's starting to feel like freedom, purifying, groundless, exhilarating freedom, terrifying, groundless, exhilarating freedom. The spiritually awake person learns to sit in that groundlessness without panicking. They trust that the next chapter is forming even when they can't see it yet. They stop forcing clarity and start allowing it to arrive on its own schedule. And when it does arrive, when the new direction finally reveals itself, it doesn't look like the old goals at all. It's quieter, simpler, more personal, less impressive to the outside world, and infinitely more meaningful to the person living it. That is what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming more successful by the world's standards, but becoming more yourself by your souls. The 10th thing spiritually awake people stop doing is ignoring the messages of their body. You treated your body like a machine. You pushed it, you ignored its signals. When it was tired, you drank caffeine. When it was in pain, you took a pill. When it was tense, you told yourself to push through. The body was an inconvenience, something to be overridden, maintained just enough to keep functioning so the mind could continue its relentless march forward. But your body was never just a machine. It was always speaking to you. The knot in your stomach before a meeting you dreaded. the tightness in your chest when you were around someone who felt unsafe, the headache that arrived every Sunday night before the work week began, the exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix because it wasn't physical tiredness, it was soul tiredness. And you ignored all of it because you were taught that the body's messages are inconveniences to be managed, not intelligence to be respected. Jung understood that the psyche expresses itself through the body. He saw it constantly in his clinical work. A patient would suppress their rage and their jaw would lock. A patient would deny their grief and their throat would close. A patient would refuse to acknowledge their desire to change their life, and their body would develop symptoms that forced the change anyway. The body, Jung recognized, is not separate from the soul. It is the soul's instrument. And when the soul is not being heard through the mind, it speaks through the flesh. The spiritually awake person begins to listen. They notice the tension, and instead of reaching for the aspirin, they ask, "What am I holding?" They notice the fatigue, and instead of powering through, they ask, "What am I avoiding?" They notice the restlessness, and instead of numbing it with distraction, they sit with it and let it reveal what it came to say. This is not about becoming obsessed with physical symptoms. It's about recognizing the body as a partner in the process of awakening, not an obstacle to it. It's about understanding that when your shoulders are tight, there might be something you're carrying that you need to put down. When your sleep is disrupted, there might be something unresolved that's trying to surface. When your energy drops around a particular person or in a particular environment, your body is giving you information that your mind might be too polite to acknowledge. Jung would say that the body doesn't lie. The mind can rationalize anything. The ego can construct elaborate justifications for staying in situations that are destroying you. But the body just tells the truth. It tenses when you're unsafe. It relaxes when you're aligned. It aches when something is wrong and releases when something is right. Learning to read this language is one of the most powerful things a spiritually awake person can do. Because once you start trusting the body's wisdom, you gain access to a kind of guidance that is immediate, personal, and incorruptible. The 11th thing spiritually awake people stop doing is performing spirituality. And this one might be the most important because it's the trap that catches the people who think they've already woken up. You found meditation, you found breath work, you found the books, the retreats, the language. You started saying things like, "Everything happens for a reason, and just stay positive, and I'm focusing on my vibration." You curated a spiritual identity the same way you once curated a professional one. Different packaging, same mechanism. Because the ego doesn't die when you start a spiritual practice. It adapts, it puts on new clothes. Jung saw this with devastating clarity. He called it spiritual bypassing, using spiritual ideas to avoid the painful, messy, difficult work of actual psychological transformation. The person who says, "I've forgiven everyone," without ever feeling the rage. The person who claims, "I'm at peace," while their relationships crumble around them. The person who meditates for an hour every morning and still treats the people in their life with quiet contempt. These are not signs of awakening. They're signs of a very sophisticated ego wearing a spiritual costume. Jung was blunt about this. He said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And one of the most common anythings is to substitute spiritual performance for genuine inner work. You can read every book Jung ever wrote. You can attend every seminar, learn every concept, master every practice. But if you haven't sat with your shadow, if you haven't faced the parts of yourself that scare you, if you haven't wept over the things you've done and the things that were done to you, then the spirituality is a layer of paint on a cracking wall. The spiritually awake person recognizes this trap because they've probably fallen into it at least once. They've caught themselves posting about gratitude while feeling empty inside. They've noticed themselves using spiritual language to avoid a difficult conversation. They felt the difference between talking about presence and actually being present. And that moment of recognition, that honest, humbling admission that I was performing, is itself a deeper awakening than any meditation retreat could offer. True spiritual awakening is not beautiful. It is not serene. It is not Instagrammable. It is brutal, confusing, lonely, and it strips away every comfortable story you've ever told yourself about who you are. It doesn't make you more confident in your beliefs. It makes you less certain about everything. And in that uncertainty, in that raw, unpolished, terrifyingly honest space, the real work finally begins. The awake person stops trying to look spiritual and starts trying to be honest. They stop chasing peak experiences and start paying attention to ordinary moments. They stop performing transformation and start enduring it. And the difference is everything, because performance is for the audience, but transformation is for the soul. And the soul knows the difference, even when no one else does. The 12th thing spiritually awake people stop doing is waiting to become who they are. This is where everything we've discussed comes together. Because underneath all the approval seeking, the controlling, the shadow avoidance, the noise, the performing, there is one final persistent illusion that keeps people locked in place. And it sounds like this: I'll start living when I'm ready, when I've healed enough, when I've figured it out, when I'm worthy. It's the myth of the finished self. The idea that there is some future version of you who has it all together, who's done the work, who's achieved the peace, and that your current self is just a rough draft. And so you wait, you delay. You tell yourself that you'll speak your truth when you're more confident, that you'll pursue your calling when you're more qualified, that you'll be yourself when you've figured out who that is. But Jung understood that the self is not a destination. It is a process. Individuation doesn't end. You don't arrive at wholeness and stay there. You move toward it endlessly, through every experience, every failure, every dark night, every ordinary Tuesday. The person you are right now, confused, imperfect, still carrying wounds you haven't fully healed, that person is not the obstacle to your becoming. That person is your becoming. You are not waiting to become yourself. You are becoming yourself right now, in this moment, with all of your mess and all of your beauty and all of the things you haven't figured out yet. The spiritually awake person stops waiting, not because they've arrived, but because they've realized there is nowhere to arrive at. There is only this breath, this day, this imperfect, ongoing, never finished life. And it is enough, not because it meets some standard, but because it is real. And real, Jung would say, is infinitely more valuable than perfect. They stop saying someday and start saying now. They stop treating their life as a rehearsal for a better life and start living the one they have. They speak the truth they have today, knowing it may change tomorrow. They love with the heart they have now, knowing it's still learning. They create with the skills they have in this moment, knowing they're still growing. And they do all of this not because they've conquered their fear, but because they've stopped letting fear be the reason they don't begin. Jung believed that the greatest tragedy of human life is not suffering. It is unlived life, the potential that never becomes actual, the song that's never sung, the truth that's never spoken, the self that's never risked. And the spiritually awake person has decided quietly, firmly, and without fanfare that they would rather live imperfectly and honestly than perfectly and falsely. that they would rather be a rough, real, unfinished version of themselves than a polished, hollow performance of someone else. And that decision, that single, ongoing, daily decision to show up as you actually are, is the entire journey. Not the beginning, not the prerequisite, the journey itself. So here you are, at the end of this, but really at the beginning of something else. We walked through 12 things that spiritually awake people slowly stop doing. Seeking approval, controlling everything, running from the shadow, identifying with thoughts, fighting to be right, filling silence with noise, chasing constant happiness, holding on to empty relationships, living by someone else's definition of success, ignoring the body, performing spirituality, and waiting to become who they already are. And maybe you recognized yourself in one of these. Maybe you recognized yourself in all of them. Maybe you're in the middle of releasing something right now, today, as you listen, and you didn't even know it had a name until this moment. Here's what I want you to remember. None of this means you're doing life wrong. All of these things, the approval seeking, the controlling, the noise, they served you once. They were survival strategies for a world that demanded performance, and they worked until they didn't. The fact that they're falling away is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that you've outgrown the armor, that the person underneath is finally strong enough to stand without it. Jung spent his life helping people understand that the soul has its own agenda. It knows where it's going even when you don't. And if you've been feeling lost lately, disoriented, out of step with the world you used to fit into, consider the possibility that you're not lost at all. You're just being led somewhere your old self doesn't recognize yet. And that's okay, more than okay. That's the whole point. Your solitude is not emptiness. It is space for something new to grow. Your confusion is not weakness. It is the old certainties making way for deeper ones. Your sadness is not a problem to solve. It is your soul's way of telling you that something real is finally being felt. You don't need to rush this. You don't need to understand it all today. You just need to understand it all today. You just need to keep listening, keep showing up, keep choosing honesty over performance, keep choosing depth over comfort, keep choosing yourself, the real one, the unfinished one, the one who doesn't have all the answers, but who is brave enough to keep asking the questions. That is what it means to be spiritually awake, not to have reached the end of the journey, but to have finally begun it, with your eyes open, with your heart intact, with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you are becoming who you were always meant to be, and nothing, not even you, can stop that now. If this reached something in you today, leave a comment and tell me which of these 12 things you felt most personally. Was there one that made you stop and take a breath? I'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue this conversation. And remember, the next time someone doesn't understand your need for silence, your desire to step back, your quiet revolution, you don't owe them an explanation. You only owe yourself the truth. And you've already started telling it.